guys, it's Celestia, and AI art is a topic that I've been avoiding discussing in the past few months because quite frankly, any new information about it these days is basically just a relentless barrage of bad news, at least for artists, and I don't want to drown myself or all of you in negativity. It's something you guys have actually requested on multiple occasions too, explaining that there's already so much bad news out there about AI, artificially generated images, and their impact on both artists and the environment that the last thing you want after a long day of hearing about it is a video you're trying to wind down with talking about it too. And I get that, I feel the same. But every once in a while something happens in the AI art world that's so notable and significant that I can't not make an exception and talk about it. And today's video is one of those exceptions. If it helps though, for the first time in the history of this channel, the AI related news I want to update you on isn't all negative. Before I get into what it is though, please do be aware that this is my subjective commentary on this news and is, by nature of that, influenced by my personal bias, which is, in this case, against generative AI. I do my best to present the news itself with as much objectivity as possible, but the commentary I add to it is inevitably going to be through the lens of that bias. But moving on, I've made multiple videos explaining my stance on why I believe AI art generators to be unethical and exploitative in the past, and you're welcome to check those out via the iCard above if you're interested. But the moral dilemma they pose isn't exactly what I'm going to be discussing today. I think I've done that more than enough. Today's news, conversely, is about something much more objective, the legality of it. As most of you are probably aware, from the moment AI image generators improved enough to be considered for use in professional settings, there's been an overwhelming amount of debate as to whether or not the images they generate can be copyrighted. They're only able to generate the images that AI artists now seek to copyright because they were trained illegally and unethically on the work of thousands of artists without their consent. And they've been known for quite some time now to directly copy and plagiarize specific artists' work and styles in their outputs, intentionally or unintentionally. They're only able to exist at all because they were trained to copy the existing work of artists who spent years building their skills enough to be able to make it. And it's been the opinion of many, myself included, that the fact that their output is subsequently derivative of that work should mean that that output cannot legally belong to the person who prompted it. As far as I'm concerned, it shouldn't be allowed to continue to exist at all, unless it's trained ethically and on the work of consenting artists, but I'm well aware that that's not a realistic expectation. I did, however, hold out some form of hope that the legal system would at least prevent those who use it from claiming legal ownership over images generated using stolen art. Not because they care about the morality of it being stolen, obviously. It's the government. They care about morality about as much as they care about anything that isn't profit. But because on a purely technical level, AI artists are simply not involved enough in the process of the generation of those images for it to be reasonably legal for them to claim them as their own. Well, ostensibly. That is a matter of opinion, since the degree of involvement a person has to have in the creation of a thing in order to own it isn't exactly quantifiable or objectively measured. Regardless of the uncertainty surrounding particular ratios or situations, though, this has been something many governments have been debating in a wider sense for years now. AI images do require input from human prompters to be generated, and there is subsequently some degree of involvement from the prompter in its creation. The AI isn't generating the idea, unless you generate one at random or ask ChatGPT for ideas, which people do, at which point I really wonder what the point of making that thing even is if no part of it is yours at all, but whatever. For the most part, the concept that an artificially generated image depicts does belong to the prompter. Their prompt, many of which are incredibly detailed and specific, is unique to them, and is, in my opinion, a form of creative expression. But that's the only thing that is. The algorithm that interprets that idea and produces a visual output based on it is solely responsible for the creation of absolutely everything else. And it's been largely agreed upon up until recently that that means that that visual output can't be considered the prompter's property. The only involvement they had in it was providing the concept, and they played no role in turning that concept into something more. So of course there's no reasonable basis for them to formally and officially claim it as theirs. It's no different than commissioning an artist. You tell them what you want, and then they make it. And just like people revise AI art after it's been created, the artist creates revisions based on your ideas during the creation process. Does the commissioner play an important role in the creative process by contributing those ideas and requesting those revisions? Absolutely. It's a joint effort produced by the creativity and skill of both parties. Does the commissioner then get to claim that they drew that art and it's theirs, and they should automatically have the right to profit from its sale and licensing and do whatever they want with it? No. They have to pay a pretty significant fee to get the commercial rights to the art that they commission, if the artist is even open to that negotiation. And even then, they don't get to claim that they made it, because they didn't. They provided the idea for it, and then the artist made it. We obviously can't measure the significance of the idea versus the significance of the artistic expression when it comes to establishing who contributed more. But at least legally speaking, the artistic expression has always been viewed as contributing so much more to the art's creation that it legally belongs to the person responsible for it. You can't copyright an idea, but but you can copyright art, because broadly speaking, the artist plays much more of a role in its creation than the person who came up with its concept. The same has been long since accepted for singers and songwriters, producers and writers, and so on. AI art is no different. Yes, the person prompting it has an idea that is creative and valuable in and of itself, but they're not actively participating in any part of the process that generates an image based on it. I'm not suggesting that coming up with and articulating the ideas they use in prompts isn't a form of art in and of itself, but it's not a form of visual art in terms of how it's created beyond that. The output is visual, but the contribution from the prompter is not, so it's reasonable to think that the output shouldn't belong to them even if it's based on an idea that does. The ideas have value, they're creative, they're expressive, and it sincerely bugs me when people argue that AI artists have no creativity and contribute nothing to their images, because in many cases, that's not true. AI prompting in and of itself, I would argue, could be considered its own medium of art, because conceptualizing a genuinely good piece is a skill in and of itself, but only if the algorithm interpreting those prompts isn't actively plagiarizing the work of human artists everywhere to make it, and only if it's recognized that the artist can only claim their idea as their own, and not the visual output itself that they played no role in. For example, movies couldn't exist without directors telling everyone what to do and how to act, and they're integral to the filmmaking process to an irreplaceable degree. The role they play in the creation of a movie is massive, but just as their movies couldn't exist without them, their movies also couldn't exist without the equally massive number of staff actually bringing the director's ideas to life. Imagine watching a movie with exceptional actors, immersive sound design, gorgeous music, and exceptional effects and editing, and the credits roll, and it's just the director's name, and then the screen goes black, and that's it. It's just theirs. It was their idea, so no one involved in the process of bringing that idea to life is relevant. AI prompters are like that. Directors taking credit for entire movies that hundreds of other people actually physically created based solely on the fact that they provided the concepts and guidance. Except in this case, not only are they taking credit for the whole movie, the staff actually making it plagiarized all of the many aspects of its production that the director didn't contribute themselves. And that's exactly why I and many others were holding out hope that on the basis of logic alone, legislation would side against letting them do that, because it just doesn't make sense to. And finally, just as I was losing that hope and letting myself slip into the comforting embrace of nihilism and misanthropy, that's what has actually happened. Kind of. Don't get excited, it's not the wildly great news it sounds like. It's still not legally banned to copyright AI art. There's been no change in the actual legislature to my knowledge, at least in North America, but there has still been progress. A recently released report from the US Copyright Office has officially ruled that copyright law only protects work of human creation, and regardless of how detailed or thorough the human prompter's input may be, the image created by AI based on it does not meet that criteria. They've acknowledged that in the future, the technology may develop in such a way that it allows human artists to utilize it as a tool and therefore actively participate in its visual creation, and that in theory, if that were the case, there would be an argument to be made in defense of copyright eligibility for human-made art created with AI assistance. But as of right now, according to that report, the evidence as to the operation of today's AI systems indicates that this is not currently the case. Prompts do not appear to adequately determine the expressive elements produced, or control how the system translates them into an output. As an example, they showed how when Google's Gemini was prompted to produce an image of a cat smoking a pipe and reading a book, and I love them for choosing that example, it both ignored parts of the prompt and added new elements at random that were not even prompted at all, effectively proving that it contributes more of its own influence to the output than the prompter, or at least a significant amount of it. This isn't the only example, of course. The report goes into much more detail and provides many more examples and points for consideration. But regardless of the specifics that you're welcome to check out via the link in the description, what matters in the context of this summary is that this is a huge win. The US Copyright Office has openly concluded that artificially generated images are not human creations and should not be allowed to be owned by the person who generated them, saying, "Prompts alone do not provide sufficient human control to make users of an AI system the authors of the output." And that is hugely significant, even if there are caveats to it. And in fairness, I understand why there are. They acknowledge that prompts themselves may be eligible for copyright, which I'm in complete agreement with based on what I've already said. They also included a different example contrasting Google Gemini's, in which a human artist created a sketch, which AI then turned into a fully rendered piece, arguing that that contributed enough human creativity to qualify for potential copyright in theory. And based on all of that, they finished the report by saying that they don't think that as of right now, there should be any change in the law based on their report, stating, "Even if Congress were to consider addressing this issue through legislation, greater clarity would be difficult to achieve. Because the copyrightability inquiry requires analysis of each work and the context of its creation, legislation, statutory language would be limited in its ability to provide brighter lines. Unless and until future developments raise new problems, the office does not recommend a change in the law. And while I still do disagree with that based on things I'll get to in a minute here, I do see that that's a pretty reasonable approach in theory. And regardless of my disagreement, they are at least acknowledging that this is a nuanced issue that needs to be considered carefully and on a case-by-case basis. And based on the fact that they did just consider one case of an individual applying to copyright their AI-generated image and decide to reject it, they are clearly willing to be open-minded and fair to some degree. I understand why they don't recommend altogether prohibiting AI-generated content in copyright law, especially given how little we know about how its uses will change and develop over time, and how complicated it is to accurately and fairly judge the human authorship of anything anymore. I understand the need to assess each copyright application for AI-generated content individually, rather than banning them all outright or allowing them all outright. And I'm just sincerely overwhelmingly happy that they're at least approaching this cautiously and critically, and, seemingly, preserving the value and importance of human-made art. Putting aside the fact that I personally believe it should be banned regardless of all of this, simply because it's all the product of plagiarism and is putting creatives everywhere out of jobs and destroying the planet, it's a fair conclusion to reach if it wasn't doing all of those things. And since the people in charge don't care that it's doing those things, it's probably the best possible outcome, at least until we can convince them to start caring. And this is where I was going to end the script when I first started writing it, but less than a month after they made that ruling, they've already made their first exception. Well, not exception, really. They ruled that generally speaking, AI art wasn't eligible for copyright, but that there was room for negotiation on a case-by-case basis if a certain level of human authorship could be proven for individual images, something they reiterated the possibility for quite clearly when the second part of their report was released. But even so, it did spark some degree of hope in a lot of artists that it would mean that the majority of AI-generated images wouldn't be eligible for copyright, even if there were a few outliers here and there. Which is why it was so overwhelmingly disappointing when they wasted so little time in proving that those outliers might not be the rarity they suggested they would be. Kent Kiersey, the founder of Invoke, a generative AI platform for creative production, as it calls itself, applied to copyright an image that he created with it on the basis that they developed so much control over the generation process that that constituted human authorship. The Copyright Office disagreed and denied the application based on lack of human authorship. This displeased Kiersey, so in August of 2024, he applied again with a different image, titled A Single Piece of American Cheese, only to be met with the same rejection. At first, until he petitioned for reconsideration, which resulted in his image being granted the first copyright protection since the general ruling that we hoped would prevent this. Kiersey's biggest defense of his image's human authorship, and likely the most persuasive factor that convinced the Copyright Office to reconsider, is that he can prove exactly how much control he had over the generation process, and how much of his own work, effort, and revising he contributed, even providing a screen recording of how he made it. He essentially argues that he was so heavily involved in the conceptualization, editing, combining, and refining of the image that that should meet the minimum threshold of human participation required for copyright protection. As he puts it, the intent and purpose was to show that there is a threshold, and if you cross that, human creativity can merit the copyright. The Copyright Office doesn't really provide great guidance because it doesn't have any examples. It says there is a threshold, but the challenge right now is that we need good examples. We need demonstration. And that is fundamentally a sound argument that I struggle to disagree with. I do believe that human creativity merits copyright in some instances, in the same way co-authorship is granted to people who have worked together to create a piece of art. I don't know what that would look like if the other person is an algorithm, but it's not unprecedented as a concept. And I do believe that the work and refinement that he put into the creation of this image are, in and of themselves, creative and valuable, as was the idea that prompted it in the first place. I don't know how much control he really did have over it, since I honestly don't fully know what he did, how he did it, or how Invoke really works. But I do think it's worth better establishing the degree and nature of human participation that's necessary here. But none of that changes that this ruling came as a heartbreaking disappointment anyway, because every defense I've made in favor of AI so far has been hypothetical. In theory, these are important moral questions to discuss if the generative models used were as harmless as other tools for the creation of art. It wouldn't be dissimilar to the arguments surrounding the validity of digital art itself, when the tools required for its creation were first introduced. If AI art generators were as harmless as Photoshop, I would honestly see a lot of value in engaging in all of these discussions about how to manage its use fairly. But it isn't. At the end of the day, their arguments are based on the assumption that these models are the same as Photoshop, that this is just like when digital art was born and we learned to accept it as its own medium, separate from, but mostly equally valuable as, traditional art, and photography before that. And if they were, I would be the first to advocate for AI-generated images being seen as their own medium of art, separate from all of those but still recognized and acknowledged. But this is not just a tool, it's a substitute for tools. It doesn't equip you to bring your ideas to life, it just brings them to life for you. And yes, there's something to be said about the fact that people like Kierzy are developing actual tools with which to participate in the image's creation with a high degree of control, but that's still just providing tools to refine something that you should have needed tools to create. I'll save you the rest of that tangent about my stance on that though, and just direct you to the video in the iCard above if you're interested in hearing more. The point is that even on a fundamental level, image generators are not tools in the same way that any other artistic tool has ever been. And while it perhaps could be turned into one if handled right to at least create a different form of art, rather than a substitute for art that's human-made, even that doesn't change that it's still far from harmless. It's trained on stolen art. It's being used to plagiarize, to scam, to exploit, to devalue artistic skill and human creativity, to put artists out of work just like AI as a whole is slowly doing to every field. And all at the cost of the terrifying toll it's taking on the planet's resources and energy just to function at all. And that's what I want to remind people of when they hear arguments like Kierzy's that are, to a degree, a sincerely compelling defense of it. Because maybe, theoretically, in a world where it did none of those things, he would be right. But we're not living in that world, and at least in my opinion, he isn't. You have to forget the harm these generators are doing in order to entertain the defenses of it, and that's exactly what its defenders want us to do when they focus on the details like this rather than the bigger picture. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether AI art should be allowed to be copyrighted on the basis of human authorship, participation, creativity, or anything else, because even if all of that criteria was met, it still wouldn't make it harmless. What matters is that harm, because it makes everything else irrelevant. Again, at least in my opinion. At the end of the day though, I still think this is an overall positive update in terms of AI art news. Not because I think it's all we should be aiming for, but because it's a step in that direction. Until we can convince lawmakers to see that harm that makes all of these contemplations fundamentally irrelevant, and I do think it's incredibly important that we fight to, it's at least a small victory to celebrate when we can at least get them to acknowledge that the other ways it does harm make it worth prohibiting, or limiting at the very least. It's not the best case scenario in general, but I think it's the best case scenario that we could have reasonably gotten here, and that's something. And hopefully, fingers crossed, exceptions like the one they just made are going to be as rare as they suggest. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak42, Haruki Saluzzo, Kinga James, CB Lil Thing, Art of Amethyst Fable, Extinction Animation, Andy the Hedgehog, Kai the Memer, Jazz, and Mad Girls Arts, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Chamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yin, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Celine Moongazer, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Catbus, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Beebe, Friday, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Wing Tang Wong, Marie Greer, Potato, Jazz, and Willow Redwood. And I'll see you in the next one.